terms of politicians and dirty advertising. And Senator Danforth stood up at the eulogy, called out a number of people, including himself, at the eulogy of Tom Schweik. It's been a year since. What has changed? What has transpired? We can look at it ourselves, but it's been looked at from some outside news organizations because it seems like what's going on here in Missouri is making some national news. Andy Kroll is a writer for the Rolling Stone. He has written about Missouri politics in the Rolling Stone, as well as for the New Republic. Andy Kroll, thanks for joining us here in St. Louis on the Big 550 KTRS.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You got it. What is it about the national media, and I guess I'll put you as a member of the national media writing for these national publications, that so interested you about what happened a year ago with Tom Schweik?
It was one of those situations where I followed the news of Tom Schweik's death just over a year ago, as you said, through the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, through the, I believe it was a Tony Messenger column that first caught my attention. And I thought to myself, well, that's horrible, that's tragic. And two, how did this happen, and what would have driven a man to do this? And then, of course, a month later, as I'm, following the news and the follow-up stories have to do with Tom Schweik's passing, Spence Jackson, his communications director, also takes his own life. And then you think, okay, there's something is going on here, or at the very least, I need to sort of make a note in my mind to possibly come back to these stories and find out, if there's something more there. And over the course of the last year, as I started calling people and visiting Missouri, and getting to understand Missouri politics, and how it's played, especially on the Republican side, I thought there's a bigger story here that is not only has to do with Tom Schweik, but also with the state of politics in Missouri and what that could mean for the rest of the country as well.
Yeah, let's talk about Jeff Rowe, because Jeff Rowe is sort of a major character in the Tom Schweik story, but a player on the national scene as well, because now he is running Ted Cruz's campaign. You talked to Jeff Rowe. You've talked about Jeff Rowe. You've written about Jeff Rowe. He is, I don't know how to describe Jeff Rowe, but he is so powerful. Senator Danforth has been quoted as saying politicians hire him because they're afraid of him, and he's a consultant.
One of the most striking things in doing both a story for the New Republic was a profile of Jeff Rowe in his capacity as Ted Cruz's campaign manager, and then also the story for Tom Schweik for Rolling Stone was just this small class of consultants in Missouri who really exert so much power over the state's politics, whether it is creating primary races, where a primary election would not be one if not for a consultant sort of stepping in, consultants, controlling the legislative agenda in some ways, and having their own sort of fiefdoms, as I quote one consultant is saying in the Tom Schweik story, in various parts of the state, and you've got to hire people if you want to have inroads in those parts of the state. It was totally fascinating, and Jeff Rowe is the most powerful of them all in the state of Missouri, and he has this reputation, as you and your listeners I'm sure know. It's just a cutthroat, win at all costs operative, and you think we saw that both in the context of what happened with Tom Schweik, but especially within the Cruz campaign thus far.
Yeah, Jeff Rowe being one consultant, but it just shocks me when a politician will tell someone, "I'm hiring this consultant because I'm afraid of them." Right? I mean, talk about wagging the tail, wagging the dog. A politician is hiring a consultant because they're afraid of what he might do if I don't hire him, and this is supposed to be the person leading us in, representing us down in Jefferson City.
Yeah, and I mean, Tom Schweik himself said at a Lincoln Days dinner in St. Louis in 2013 that he had been approached by a consultant who said, you should hire me because I'm going to protect you from this other consultant. In Schweik's own words, he likened it to, some kind of, mob style, almost like a protection offer. He didn't name who those consultants were, but it was striking to hear him say that. And in some of his unpublished writings that I got my hands on for this story, he continues that sort of mob theme, and these sort of unelected but extremely powerful and increasingly, wealthy consultants just exerting so much sort of under the radar influence, and in some cases above the radar influence in Missouri politics.
Andy Kroll, our guest, he wrote an article for Rolling Stone, did a vicious campaign drive a candidate to suicide. One of the main topics was the quote-unquote whisper campaign about Tom Schweik being Jewish. And you can't talk about this without talking about another consultant, John Hancock, who was in the crosshairs during and after the suicide because he was criticized by Tom Schweik and by others as a quote-unquote whispering campaign. I find it most interesting that John Hancock worked for Tom Schweik, went around the state telling people he was Jewish, but didn't know that he wasn't Jewish, right? Here's a world-class political operative who worked with somebody who was going around spreading misinformation about him by accident.
The other piece of John Hancock's biography that's notable here as well is that he is or was a specialist in opposition research, which is the art and science of knowing everything you possibly can about either an opposing candidate or, in a lot of cases, a candidate him or herself will hire a John Hancock and say, do a book on me and find out where my vulnerabilities are. What would my opponents say about me if I ran for Congress or state senate or what have you? I spoke to John Hancock at length for this story. One, he said he never did a book on Tom Schweik, but he did work for him, as you note and as I write in the story. And when I asked him, how did you not know? He, as I write in the story, he said that he basically made an assumption based on the man's last name and told me that it was something stupid that he had done, but that there was nothing malicious about it. Obviously, Senator Danforth has believed that there was something more malicious about it. I believe he's called it a sort of phishing campaign on Hancock's behalf. I mean, it's something that I've tried to wrap my head around as well, given that John Hancock was this opposition research specialist and had known Tom from working for him, and Tom Schweik was one of the only statewide Republicans in Missouri, and you'd think that he would be a known quantity to everyone in the state, but John Hancock says that wasn't the case, and then obviously denies that there was any kind of whispering campaign,
right?
But not denies that he told people that Tom Schweik was of the Jewish faith.
Sure. So in your story, Andy Kroll from the Rolling Stones, you point out in great detail that many people who have now since denied it, but in your reporting went up to Tom Schweik and made reference to it. We're friends of his. We're supporters of his, saying, look, I'll give you the money, but make sure I don't want to give you the money because it'll look like one Jewish person is supporting another Jewish person. You quoted John Loudon, who was a friend of the show, who told him, hey, people are going to think you're Jewish, so make sure they realize you're not Jewish. So in your reporting, it was sort of one of those things you told him if you were a friend of his, make sure there are some parts of the state that know you're not Jewish. So it was sort of a well-known secret that Jewish people have a hard time winning in the state of Missouri.
Yeah, and people point to a eerily similar race for auditor 8 years before Tom Schweik first ran. This was a fellow named Jake Hansler, who, of course, famously lost his Republican primary to a fellow named Al Hansen, who was, I believe, a convicted criminal, had been convicted for fraud in the past. This is for the position of auditor. And Jake Hansler was, far and away the more qualified candidate, had the support of the party, and lost badly to Al Hansen. And people point to, and Jake Hansler is Episcopalian. I talked to Jay at length for the story at his office, but people pointed to that as, perhaps there were folks around in certain parts of the state who sort of looked at his name, always from, University City area in St. Louis or Clayton, and he just assumed he must be Jewish and didn't vote for him. And I did find it very interesting in those emails that you just mentioned that I should say were in that I had gotten, there were notes of Tom's that I'd gotten my hand, Tom Schweik's that I'd gotten my hands on. People saying that there is anti-Semitism in the Republican Party base is not something that people will typically pro-offer in an interview when you just ask him about it. It's an uncomfortable subject. But in Tom's private notes to himself, it was clear on multiple occasions people had come up to him and raised this point with him and said, you got to be aware of this when you run for auditor, when you run statewide. And in some cases, say you should put on your campaign literature that you're, make sure that people know you and your family are a member of a church. So it was both interesting to me to get some unvarnished evidence that this element does exist in the eyes of some people in some parts of the state, and also that Schweik had been aware of it and had done what he could to make sure people knew that he was Episcopalian that first time when he ran.
Andy Kroll with us, Rolling Stones reporter who did extensive research on Tom Schweik and what transpired in the last year or so. The article, you can find it at rollingstone.com. You can, heaven forbid, actually go and buy a magazine, or it's called Did a Vicious Campaign Drive a Candidate to Suicide? So, Andy Kroll, John Hancock said he never said it and then said he said it, but he can't remember who he said it to. But everyone who we had on the show who came forward who said John Hancock said it to them, he's convinced he didn't say it to those people, but he knows he said it, but he can't remember who he said it to. But everyone who said he said it to them, he says, I know I didn't say it to them.
Yeah, I think I followed that and brought all that up with John in the interview that we had and a follow-up conversation as well. I mean, I worked as hard as I could to try to find other people who would go on the record to talk about this, talk to Schweik people to go on the record about this, and had a hard time doing that. What I would say is that, it's John, as you said, that he might have said something but doesn't recall it. When I pushed him around, he said he probably said something that had to do with Tom Schweik, him thinking Tom Schweik was Jewish. But I would say someone else who I corresponded with a little bit in the course of the story was David Humphreys, a Republican donor out of Joplin. Mm-hmm. He was the fellow folks might remember who filed an affidavit saying that John Hancock had told him that Tom Schweik was Jewish. He perceived this as something as a comment made negatively as anti-Semitic, and came forward with this affidavit a few weeks, I believe it was, after Schweik's death. And I followed up with David Humphreys to just confirm the details of that. And he said, yeah, I mean, I stand by everything in that. And I really did believe that this was a comment made against Tom.
Right.
And one thing I didn't realize is in his affidavit, he says that he went to an associate afterward and said, I'm not going to tell you what just happened or why, but I don't want us giving any money to John Hancock. And what they didn't realize until I sort of followed up with David Humphreys is that associate was actually his mother. David Humphreys' mother, who leads the board of David Humphreys' company, Tomco, down in Joplin, and I thought that was interesting as well.
So,
And when I asked John Hancock about what David Humphreys said, he doesn't dispute it, and doesn't argue with him.
so here's the $64,000 question, Andy Kroll, with all of your reporting. John Hancock being a world-class operative, he would certainly know that there is some anti-Semitic feelings around, since everybody else sort of knew in that world. He tells David Humphreys and admits that he tells it otherwise. You going to tell me that he didn't know that he was spreading crumbs around, mentioning that the man was Jewish when he wasn't Jewish, and he did it just sort of in natural conversation? Like, did you know the guy was born Aquarius? While the rest of the state knew that in some circles it was a negative?
I'm not gonna speculate on it like that. I mean, in my mind, I've always wondered, given John's background in opposition research and experience in the party, I've always scratched my head at how he would have gotten Tom's faith wrong, which he obviously openly admitted to doing, and said that publicly, and said that in a phone call with John Danforth at one point. I mean, I don't want to. I'll let other people like Danforth extrapolate what they believe that John Hancock was doing, if what his intentions may have been. I mean, I stick to my facts that I've gotten in 6 months of reporting this, but I mean, obviously you would be aware of all those things. I mean, John Hancock is a steeped in Republican politics in Missouri, and now leads the party. Was the executive director for a while, but I don't want to take it further than that. What is clear is that Tom Schweik was really perceived this as something to undermine him, and he had never felt like he was accepted or belonged in the state Republican Party. He'd never really gotten along with folks like Jeff Rowe. He churned through basically every consultant in the state of Missouri, for his own reasons and for theirs as well. And I think he just, this in his mind, he felt that here we go again. My own party. It's one thing if I'm going up against Chris Koster or Claire McCaskill or whatever, but my own party is finding some new way to undermine me. And it's just so clear from the police report, from interviewing people close to him, from his own, emails and text messages, that this thing just consumed him.
Is that Andy Kroll from the Rolling Stone? Is that what killed him? I mean, what was it? What was the final straw for Tom Schweik? Did you ever find out?
I mean, I think it was a confluence. It was a perfect storm of factors. I think it was absolutely that he believed that there was this campaign against him, this sort of, sub rosa, what he called a whisper campaign against him. I think it was also that he wanted to go public with it, and everyone around him in his inner circle strongly advised him not to, and said that he shouldn't do that. I think it was the Barney Fife radio ad that Jeff Rowe has taken credit for, runs on the eve of the Lincoln Days annual conference, the biggest event of 2015, and his first big event as candidate for governor. I think it was that. I think he was also personally a thin-skinned, wired, tightly wound guy. And he took slights personally, and too personally, probably. Should that disqualify you when everything else on your resume says you'd be a superb candidate for office? I don't think it should. It doesn't make you the ideal, perfect candidate for office, but But as Danforth said, should people who can only people who can take those sort of flights run for office?
Yeah.
I hope not.
Andy Kroll, Rolling Stone, did a vicious campaign drive a candidate to suicide. RollingStone.com, also the new Republican. We'll look for anything else you have coming down the pike. Andy Kroll, thanks for stopping by.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
You got it. 9:40 here, Big 550 KTRS. Let me tell you about John B.